Hello, everybody. Welcome to Humanity Rising for a new episode. Today, we're going to be speaking about our upcoming ET studies class on the infamous Rendlesham Forest Incident in Great Britain, which is also coined Britain's Roswell, so to speak. But we'll have a look at whether this title is actually a good one or if it's misleading. And I'm very happy that today I get to host the show because Jim is on the road for the Seoul conference. As you might know, the Seoul conference is very important in disclosure. So we're excited to hear back from him what he found out there, if he can speak about it. And so I'm now going to be introducing Gary Heseltine to you, who is the lead faculty on this course, which starts next Wednesday. And Gary, you can turn on your video as well, so people can get a sense of view as well. That's So
there we go.
great
Welcome,
to
everyone.
have you back on Humanity Rising.
Thank you for having me back.
So probably most of folks in the Ubiquity universe have already heard about the new course, and today we just want to basically get a sense of what the course will be like and what it'll be about. So most of you already know Gary is a retired police investigator, and he has 24 years of experience with detective work, both in the Royal Air Force and in the National Police. Is that right, Gary?
Yeah, the British police. Yeah.
British Police, yeah. So Gary, wow, we had you on, I think in March. We found out with Stan before. We had you back last time on in March to talk about the incident. That was this year in March. Do you feel like any? Yeah. Would you say that in disclosure there has been kind of a momentum building since then, or how do you feel like?
I think we are edging closer to a disclosure breakthrough. I've been following this subject for 47 years. That's a long time. I had a sighting when I was 16, so nearly 48 years. And realistically, this is the closest in my lifetime to a breakthrough with regards to a worldwide disclosure. And that's really come about since 2017 with the New York Times article, the release of the 3 videos. Despite Aero trying to say that Go Fast has been explained, I don't buy that at all. And perhaps we'll talk about that later as to why I don't believe that's the case. But realistically, with the legislation that's been passed in the US so far, yes, it's disappointing that the Schumer Amendment hasn't gone through in 23 or in 2024, but I do feel that we're close to that breakthrough in 2025. And with all the political developments and the key positions that are now taking place in the US, perhaps many of those people that are taking these key positions have already said that they want transparency on the UAP issue. So I think in a strange kind of way, we're on the brink. Certainly in the next couple of years, I think, if all goes well.
Right. And looking at maybe we were just talking before the show started that what's been happening is the hearing in the House last week, and then this week the Senate hearing. And so, do you feel like any of that has moved the needle when it comes to the obvious validity of a case like Rendlesham?
Yes, I mean at the moment, if you look at the subject from a world perspective, many people looking in who are not American will find that there's quite a concentration in the US because that's where many of the legislative things are happening. So at the moment, they're not really looking further afield than US cases, US personnel, etc. The hearing last year with David Grush was excellent, and there was real momentum in the couple of weeks afterwards, especially in the mainstream media. Unfortunately, it coincided then with the summer recess, and then you lost some impetus, which was never really regained, but it was still impactful. And of course, the David Grush testimony, which I totally believe, did make a lot of media attention around the world that there were indeed crash retrieval programs and reverse engineering programs. So that was powerful. This year, of course, we've had 4 people give evidence in Congress. The principal 2 people for me were Tim Galladay and Luis Elizondo. One, Rear Admiral, someone of his rank, is exceptional. The fact that he had a UAP insight with the 2015 case was excellent. But the fact that he was effectively the head of NOAA, he was the oceanographer for the entire Navy. So this is somebody of a very high rank and somebody who has now come out and said without any doubt that we're dealing with non-human intelligence. So that's really good. Luis Elizondo, of course, I've met Luis. I've spoken to him and Zooms and what, etc. Luis has been a great advocate for the subject and courageous, because he effectively, I don't think he wanted to give up his career, but in order to make a breakthrough, to change the direction, he took the path to walk away and says, well, I'll try to do it from the outside. But obviously with a lot of contacts on the inside. And so for him to give his testimony was really good. I have some issues about the fact that they were only given 5 minutes to talk about themselves before questions. To me, that was a ridiculously short time. I would have said 15 minutes each and then cross-examination of questions. I still think the questioning by many of the congressmen and women could have been better. They lack focus. For me, they're ill prepared. As a former advanced police interviewer, they're too generic, and they don't pin anybody down. And if you're an outside witness, outside person looking in, you want to hear, are they real? Now, Nancy Mace was good. There's the classic clip that's been put out several times. 2 really good short questions, 2 really good short answers by Louis. Are they real? Yes. And are they to do with effectively alien crash retrieval? Yes. That's what you want to hear in a hearing. Very short, single questions. Unfortunately, what people do in general, and I used to do it before I was in the police, is when they ask a question, they ask multiple questions within the same question. And that's what the press do all the time. And if somebody comes to you and says, well, can you tell me about this and then that and then that, that's a lot for the person responding to think about. It's just difficult, and you lose context. Whereas if you're specific, were you the head of the ATIC program? Yes. Was that to do with the retrieval of crashed UFOs, UAP? Yes. Are we dealing with a non-human intelligence? Yes. They're the kind of answers that we should be putting on point, not 3 or 4 multi-layered questions, because that's difficult for anyone. But in this subject, when you have only got a few minutes to get your questions across, i.e. 5 minutes to each of the congressmen and women, you need to be on point, and they're not. They're too general, and they're not specific enough. Plus, we need the mainstream media to step up. They're one of the biggest hazards to us making progress in terms of a major disclosure, because they hold the key. It won't be social media, even though it's a powerful influence. It won't be social media that makes that breakthrough into a disclosure world where everybody knows and there's a big announcement. It will be through the mainstream media channels, which we know the media is controlled a lot. So that's the battle that you've got. But nevertheless,
it's funny,
we are moving
Gary,
forward.
I would challenge you on that. We know it's controlled, but it's also true that this second hearing was now streamed by C-SPAN. There was articles in The Guardian. There were articles on CNBC. It got a pretty much a mainstream attention, but very harshly divided. Like New York Times didn't say anything about it.
The BBC made one coverage of it, not on TV, and it was on a children's program.
Right.
like a
That's
news
ridiculous.
program
Yeah.
for teenagers. So that's not mainstream coverage. Whereas
Yeah.
after the Grush, Fravor, and Ryan Graves testimony, in those 2 weeks afterwards, there was
Mm.
multinational and lots of follow-ups on the likes of the BBC, ITV.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
UK, other than The Guardian, The Sun, one or two newspaper reports, it's not had the same impact as last year. Although
They're not
testimony
building
was excellent.
pressure. They're just basically trying to make
I think I,
minimum notice.
I think one of the key differences between last year and this year is the fact that one, it was just after the election result, and two, we've got two major things happening in the world: the Middle East conflict and
Right.
also Ukraine. So I
Yeah.
think that in terms of the mainstream media, they're very much preoccupied with those two kind of conflicts, and it's good in a way now to get the election over, and now we can hopefully start raising the issue of transparency, which many of the people set to come into key positions have already said that they want UAP transparency. So,
Yeah.
in a strange kind of way, we might be actually on the brink within the next few months. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. Just on the funny point, today in the U.S. Sun, we were featured with an article that talks about Ubiquity University and ET studies.
Yep.
And it's, of course, the way the Sun would do it. But actually, if you read it,
Sensationalism. Yeah.
it's not dismissive of the whole thing. It says it's a curious new development, and they quote Jim, and it's basically copy pasting what we have on our website. So this is a good sign that there's some interest here, and it's all they're connecting it, and they also talk about your course in the British Roswell and so on and so forth. So I think that's a great segue
Yeah.
Into the
Into
British
Rendlesham.
Roswell. I mean, is that a title that you would that you appreciate to call it the British Roswell, or is it misleading?
I think that there has been a tendency by TV documentaries to say, well, there's a Brazilian Roswell, there's a UK Roswell equivalent. And I think what they're basically just saying is it's perhaps the premier case in those particular countries. I think there are some parallels to Roswell in the sense that Rendlesham involves the US military. It involves the nuclear aspect. If you think of Roswell, the first atomic bomb squadron, the 509th, there's an interest there. Are there links to nuclear weapons with Rendlesham? Yes, there are. The big difference, I think, in many ways, that with Rendlesham, and it's poorly understood, is that we're not just talking about one or two events. We're talking about multiple UFO, UAP events, both in terms of physical and on a couple of occasions, non-human intelligence is involved over not just one day, not just 2 days, but probably a week now as a result of the reinvestigation that I did, which is contained in my book, which is in a sense based on where we are. I mean, the foreword was done by Don Smith, who's obviously done a course with you recently, and he says that that's the premier book, definitive case on the book. It took 5 years to write, 3 years, 5 years of reinvestigation, and 3 years to write. Even though I'd known about the case for many years, literally following the subject, having a childhood sighting at the age of 16, I became aware of Rendlesham as soon as it really became known, which was in 1983, with this big newspaper headline: UFO lands in Suffolk and it's official. And then followed it, and then, in a sense, became active in active research and starting to go public with it in December of 2007, when I met Colonel Holt, who at the time was a lieutenant colonel. He's the guy who wrote the famous Holt Memorandum, which admitted to 2 UFO incidents. But are there parallels? Is there a cover-up? Well, yes, there is, right from the start, because at the time of the incident, which was late December 1980, only local people who live near the twin bases of RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge began to learn things in the sense of a lot of the American people would take their cars to the local garages to get fixed and things
I
like
picked
that.
up this image, Gary. Maybe it helps understand. So
Yeah.
we're in the
Let
southeast.
me put this into context. If you
Yeah.
look at the screen now, this is a location on the east coast of the UK. If you were to look on a map of the UK, approximately 80 miles from London. So London would be south of the diagram that you've got, and the incident took place in a forest that lay between the twin bases. So if you can see RAF Bentwaters at the top and then RAF Woodbridge below, they were approximately about 4 miles apart. And it was a very rural location, and the forest lay between them. And the story became known because when the memorandum came out in 1983, it spoke and admitted that there'd been two incidents on two separate days in that area in late December 1980. So that's the key areas, the two twin military bases. Now, the actual bases are interesting themselves. They'd originally been built Second World War. They were Royal Air Force, and then they were leased to the US Air Force. So at the time of the Rendlesham incident, you have what they would be regarded as perhaps the top, what we would call strike bases. And what we mean by that is in the event of, we're talking Cold War, in the event of a Cold War aggression and a World War III scenario, they would be the bases that would dispatch squadrons of aircraft to respond to that aggression. So very key location. But at the time of the incident, very few people knew it had happened. Only local people who used to walk their dog, go through the forest, found that in the days afterwards, police were blocking off areas, pathways into the forest, which was unusual. There were roadblocks in the days after the incident. So local people had an idea, but the world essentially didn't become aware of it as an international case until this big newspaper headline in a big British tabloid called the News of the World. And it came out on a Sunday, the 2nd of October, 1983. And it had this partial clip or extract from what was called the Holt Memorandum, written by the Deputy Base Commander, retired Colonel Charles Holt. And he admitted that there'd been two incidents, one a landed craft on one night, and he'd gone out a couple of nights later and with a team of people gone to the original landing site. And whilst they're out, they then have multiple UAP, UFO, whatever you want to call them, encounters. So it was not until that document aired in the News of the World headline, almost 3 years after the event, that the US Air Force finally admitted, yes, something did happen in the forest. Prior to that, despite lots of people writing to the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence, writing to the US Air Force, writing to various politicians in the United States, they'd absolutely, totally blanked it and said, we don't know. We know something happened, but we don't have any records. And then suddenly, and perhaps accidentally, that Holt Memorandum, that one-page document came out. Well, when that came out, that really, in a sense, shook everybody up in terms of the military and governments, because it was written on US Air Force notepaper with the crest of the US Air Force, and they could no longer deny that two incidents had happened in the forest, and it had involved US Air Force security police, which were the predominant witnesses. There are more. There are civilian witnesses. There are other witnesses who were part of the backup for the US Air Force, like people who ran fuel installations to give fuel to the vehicles, etc. There are those kind of witnesses, but the principal witnesses in all of this are many US Air Force security police officers.
If you say many, like how many are we talking about?
This is a difficult question. I suspect that we're talking maybe 100 or 200 people involved. Yeah.
Wow.
Military people. The trouble is the vast majority have still yet to come forward. Of those that have come forward, we're perhaps looking at a good 20, 25 military witnesses who've gone on the record and give various accounts over the years, because we're now talking, we're coming up to 44 years after the event, but many have gone on the record. So we obviously in the course we drill down into that, and one of the things that I wanted to do in a reinvestigation is I treated it like a cold case from a police point of view. I was a detective for 19 years. I was an advanced police interviewer of suspects and witnesses. And that was qualified to murder, manslaughter, rape. So I've been involved in those kind of investigations. I was also involved as an advanced interviewer in the London bombings inquiry to 3 of the 4 scenes, interviewing first responding police officers that had gone to 3 of the 4 scenes to try to extract memories. And when you do the advanced interviewing, you learn memory tricks to try to retrieve information. So that's something that we'll talk about and is relevant to this case because I tried an advanced interview technique that's not designed to be used 30, 40 years after the incident. It's designed to be used within 24 to 72 hours. However, I still think I would try on a couple of occasions with important witnesses to re-interview to see if I could extract further information, or I suspected, having heard their testimony before, that they knew more, but perhaps other people hadn't cottoned onto that. So that worked on a couple of occasions really, really well with 2 people called Airman at the time, Steve Longero, and arguably the key most important witness to emerge and go on the record, as it were, after many years of trying to avoid it, was with a former sergeant called Adrian Bustinza. His testimony that he gave me for the book, which is key to understanding the wider aspect of the story, we'll obviously drill down into. I think that's week 2 when we look at the military witnesses. So there's lots and lots of things. So there was clearly a cover-up. And one of the things that happened that indicates there's a cover-up when that document came out, the Holt Memorandum, we didn't have social media then, so it didn't go viral in the sense that we now think through social media, but it did kind of go viral as an international headline because it was very stark. UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official, and it showed a part of this Holt Memorandum document. That's what made it credible, because that document was an official US Air Force document, and that it also was signed by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, the deputy base commander of what was a nuclear base. RAF Bentwaters was a nuclear base. So that's the key to this story. It's the American authorities will never admit that it was a nuclear base, but in the book I found documentation that said it had nuclear weapons, and also many of the airmen that I'd spoken to went on the record and said we were guarding nuclear weapons, tactical, small yield nuclear weapons that were stored in the RAF Bentwaters weapons storage area. Now, ironically, I have a link to nuclear weapons myself, is because in my 6 years in the Royal Air Force Police, for 3 of those 6 years, I guarded nuclear weapons myself on a weapons storage area. Now, in the UK, we don't call them a weapon storage area. We call them a supplementary storage area. Why? I don't know, but that's a subtle difference, but it's exactly the same. And I served on 2 nuclear weapons bases, one in Suffolk, where this incident took place, at a place called RAF Honington, a British Royal Air Force base. And then I went over to what was then West Germany, and went on another nuclear base that was called RAF Larbrook, now closed. But
no idea, Gary, but this is amazing because this gave you an understanding of
correct,
the environment and the job.
And the key thing was, I also believe that there are many more witnesses who have yet to come forward, which then turned out to lead me to Airman Steve Longero and Adrian Bustinza, because they corroborated the fact that it was nuclear weapons. And Steve Longero, without giving the game away too much, unless you've read my book, he gives an amazing incident that occurred to him whilst he was inside the weapon storage area. So I effectively guarding the nuclear weapons when he had a UFO encounter, as did many others who have yet to come forward over the nuclear weapons storage area.
Here, there are many great questions in the chat we'll get to, but Kim Kerrigan says, bingo, nuclear sites again and again, UAPs linked to our human use of nukes in related bases.
I think there's one more thing that's relevant to this as well, is that this was not an isolated series of events just in late December 1980. What I also discovered was there had been at least 3 or 4 really credible incidents before in the 12 months preceding on the basis there'd been an incident. I'll go into detail obviously on the course, but one of those incidents took place very close to the weapons storage area, so the RAF Bentwaters nuclear weapons storage area, and people were unaware of that, but that came out through the course of my reinvestigation. From I said it's got to be a cold case. Yeah. I obviously knew, I'd met people in the case. Now, there are always personalities. You'll like people, you maybe not like people, but nevertheless, they are key people. So one of the key things about doing the cold case was, how do you write it? What's your focus going to be? And my focus was going to be, I was just going to look at the evidence, anything I could find in a deep reinvestigation of the case, and then take personalities out of it, whether I'd met them or not, take personalities out of it, and then just look at the evidence of their testimony, and then, in a sense, cross-examine it, make a reasoned deductions from it. Yeah, so if somebody had gone on the record and given an interview 35 years ago, then I found those interviews, and then you went through it, and you'd look out for the key points. And then you'd say, well, this is basically what he's saying, and then we move on. So it was taking personality out of it. If you're going to do a cold case, it has to be devoid of any bias, or as best you can. It's difficult to do that. And it took a long time to really realize that that was the best approach, to take personality out of it. I'd met Holt, I'd met Jim Penniston, I'd met John Burroughs, I'd met Nick Pope, etc. So it was best to take personality out of it and focus on the evidence. Do what a cold case should do, is examine the evidence and interpret it. And that's what I tried to do.
Okay, there's so many questions. I'm just going to skip around because we're going to get in the course in the proper chronicle understanding of the course. I mean, one thing I just can't help but ask is, if you say there were nuclear weapons, what I've read about the course, about the incident so far, is it's not really like in Maelstrom or other nuclear cases where the UAP is kind of hovering directly over the silo and turning on and off some nuclear weapons. At least that's not what we've heard about.
Is a UFO right? Does, I can confirm that a UFO does shine a beam down into the nuclear bunkers and does this. It does a long scan of what's called the hot row. And the witness, Airman Steve Longero, said it was like an inspection of all the bunkers, the secret bunkers where all the nuclear weapons were contained underground.
All right, that's news.
The question is
interesting. It's not what the mainstream coverage of this. Well, they always talk about, the forest.
Correct. Yeah. But that's deliberate. I do believe that the British media are still complicit in dumbing down this case. I think that at the time of the incident, so late December 1980, after these events took place, I think that the US Air Force, for example, would have been terrified if the full extent, the full number of incidents was released. Right. Of course, and probably at the time they didn't know the full extent because people weren't talking, because people were frightened, etc., etc. But one of the things that they would have been worried about was the press getting out. So I think that they probably, at the very highest levels of UK media, brought in the top editors of the top people those that own British newspapers, etc., and said, we want you to downplay this for national security. Because a number of things happened. One, it didn't really make any press for 3 years. It was down to local researchers getting bits of information. And then when it did become public in 1983, the US Air Force had to admit that 2 incidents had occurred, but they still, to this day, don't talk about it as a UFO incident. The US Air Force will not admit anything. They don't confirm. They'll say, I can neither confirm or deny that there was nuclear weapons, but clearly there was. And many years later, Colonel Holt, in retirement, went on a National Press Club lineup put together, I think, by Robert Salas at the time, about nuclear incidents. So he did an affidavit, and at the bottom of the affidavit, it implies that, I think it's clause 12 in his personal affidavit, he actually says other people have gone on the record to say it was nuclear weapons. So it was like done through a medium. Because he was a senior ranking officer, he will never go on the record and say, yeah, there were nuclear weapons.
So is it fair to say that maybe what we can do with this course is to kind of break through this dumbing down about the case that has been done in all the popular ancient aliens?
Every new, I talk about it, that when that newspaper headline came out, it went kind of viral because it was a great headline and it referred to a proper document. So that was evidence for the press that they could focus on. However, within perhaps a week or so of that, the British media were responding by saying it was nothing more than the Orford Ness lighthouse. The beam of the lighthouse had deceived the airmen. They were frightened. They got caught up in a kind of a UFO spooky story, and they all got confused by the light of the
just like the bombing intelligence in Roswell couldn't.
This is despite
distinguish between a balloon and a UAP.
Correct. But the real problem was that the media ran with that, and the TV documentary companies for the next, until now, every documentary that's virtually ever made about Rendlesham, every book that's ever written, every newspaper piece, they'll still say, were they deceived by the Orford Ness lighthouse? Even though at the time it was not a credible, but it was adopted and became a mantra for the British newspapers for every documentary. It was ludicrous. If you examined the evidence, and this was proved, I think in 2007 with the UFO Hunters program, in which I appeared with Colonel Holt, actually on site in the weapons storage area, and I got involved, and that's where I became actively involved in the case as a public researcher. It was December 2007. And basically, that documentary showed that the beam did not cast inwards to land. It was shielded. So if you can imagine the beam going round, the light going round, the beam that would have took the sweeping arc inside was blocked off.
Yeah.
But despite that, TV documentaries still refer to the Orford Ness lighthouse. Why? It was ludicrous. At the time, Colonel Holt said, I used to take friends to the Orford Ness lighthouse because it was a nice place to visit. Of course, I knew where it was. So he was clearly saying right from the off that it wasn't the Orford Ness lighthouse.
Let me interrupt you right there, because we're talking about beams and stuff. And I think there are many people in the chat that are asking, what actually happened there, and it's a lot that happened, right? So Judy asks, could you tell us exactly what people saw? That's not an easy question to answer, is it? Is there like the most dramatic thing people saw? Like if we want to make a kind of a sneak peek for the course, what we'll go into detail, what's the most dramatic moment you would see in these series of sightings?
Okay, you have the classic ones that are repeated in the media and TV documentaries, which is what was classed originally as the first night landing of a small triangular craft about 3 meters by 3 meters, approximately 2 meters in height, that was like black, like glass to the touch, that had some raised like etchings on the side. symbols. So that's one, a landed craft that was seen by two people, although that's kind of disputed because one saw it as a solid.
Do you find it disputable?
Sorry?
Do you have doubts that they actually saw it and touched it?
No. The difference is people's perceptions of an incident. The case of the small triangular craft, which is well known, and the Americans will be well known, and all documentaries refer to it, is this first night, classed as a first night landing, this craft on the ground. Well, actually, only one person, Sergeant Jim Peniston, approached it and touched it. The other person he was with, Airman John Burroughs, was several meters behind him. So he did not approach. And from his position, perhaps 20, 30 feet behind, 30 meters, perhaps more, from his position, he said he saw a bank of lights that kind of hinted at a structure behind the bright lights. You know, like if you get dazzled, you cannot see the car behind if it's got its main headlights on, but you know that there's a car there. It's just that the lights are too bright and you can't really see much. Well, his perspective was a bank of lights, and that's what he has always said. He did not see this triangular craft. The only person that saw it and touched it was Jim Peniston. So that's one incident, a landed craft in the forest. So that, how weird is that? It wasn't a plane. It didn't have any obvious wings, tail, propulsion system, and it was either sat on the ground or sat close to the ground. Obviously, because we now know that there were depressions found, it would seem to have been on a triangular undercarriage. So it had three kind of feet underneath to support it. So that's one major incident. It's an unknown craft of unknown origin on the ground. That's the classic thing. The other thing that is well known is that Colonel Holt went out a couple of nights later with a team of airmen, and they went to that original landing site, and they were taking measurements, forensic samples, soil samples, etc., tree samples, where bark had been pulled off and something had scraped, shall we say, perhaps a craft had come down through the canopy of trees, broken off branches. So they were doing like a detailed forensic examination of the scene when they see a light themselves in the distance that then kind of approaches, that they then begin to follow that light, and it's described as like a red glowing object dripping molten metal, or what appeared to be molten metal, although no evidence was ever found, that had like a dark eye center that was described as like an eye winking at you, you know, a big dark center that moved between the trees.
Also triangular in shape.
No, that was not triangular. That was not triangular. This is a different entity, craft, whatever you want to call it. But this, they then followed, and eventually they see it over a farmer's field in a clearing, a big farmer's field. They see it beside a farmhouse, and it's sat to the left of the farmhouse, perhaps 200 meters from their location. And it's
a day or night? Again,
this is at night. This is at night, early hours, and it's glowing so brightly in this farmer's field to the left of the farmhouse from their perspective that it looks like the farmhouse windows are on fire. That's how bright it was. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what about the lighthouse? Well, the lighthouse, don't forget, Holt saw this himself. And he described to me personally that the object was low to the ground, to the left of the farmhouse from his perspective. However, he knew where the lighthouse was, and he said the lighthouse is to the right of the house, way off in the distance. And every 5 seconds you'd see this flash. 5 seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flash. And that was it. A lighthouse doesn't move. But according to the media, it did, and according to everybody else, it did. Well, it was ludicrous from the beginning. So there are those aspects, but the other aspects that were determined and uncovered during the deep dive that I did with and re-interviews with people was the Airman Steve Longero, key testimony. He says he was inside the weapons storage area at the time a UFO comes over the forest tops and then shines a beam down into the nuclear bunkers. And at the site at RAF Bentwaters, what was called the hot road, nuclear bunkers, it's just a term that's used, colloquially, that was approximately 300 meters long. And it was full of hardened doors, big metallic doors that would open and close, very, very thick for nuclear protection. And the UFO shone a beam down, all the way down, like scanning every one of those 300-meter bunkers. Yeah. And then it shot off towards the forest. Well, he then goes on to say that he was removed from the weapons storage area as other people were called to investigate what was going on in the forest. So this is just one of a series of nights where there was activity taking place. This is not just one night like a normal UFO UAP incident. It's not one incident. And Adrian Bustinza, when we talk about there is a non-human intelligence aspect, he was involved in an incident with Airman John Burroughs from that landed triangular craft. He would say that he went out on one of the nights and John Burroughs was in front of him, walking close to the edge of the farmer's field, when John was engulfed in an incredible bright white light that was so bright you could hardly see. Sergeant Adrian Bustinza would say that he felt as if he'd been knocked to the ground. He falls to his knees, sees John illuminated by this incredible bright white light, and when he looked forward, he saw some kind of figure, a small 4 or 5 feet size figure, no real detail because of the brightness, on the left side of John in the middle of the light, and then another kind of smaller figure on his right. What it is, who knows? But it's not human, and it's certainly under there in displaying intelligence. It's like it's engulfed him, and he's in the middle, surrounded by one entity on one side, one entity on the other, whether it's alien, non-human, interdimensional, whatever. It's certainly a strange incident. And, you know, there are other incidences where beings were seen, entities, whatever you want to call them. There was an incident in a field. Now, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, this key witness,
the person that was in between these two entities, did he have an experience as well?
John, all he can remember is basically being engulfed in this bright white light. He didn't see the entities either side of him. And who knows what really happened in those moments. Mm-hmm. Suffice to say that later on, when the beam goes off and everything has gone back to normal, they then return back and they have a conversation. This is all new information. They have a conversation with Colonel Holt, and Colonel Holt had given John Burroughs permission to go out into the forest, and he took Sergeant Adrian Bustinza with him. Now, from their point of view, they were only gone about 10 or 15 minutes. But when they returned after this strange incident, Colonel Holt is angry with them. Where have you been? You've been gone for 20, 30, 40 minutes. And he's saying, where have you been? So it hints that something happened involving missing time, which is classic abduction scenario. Whether it is an abduction, we don't know. But this incident I'm relating it as to what the witnesses were telling me. So you've got that incident. You've got other incidents where the original military whistleblower was a young airman, 19 at the time, first overseas tour, had not been in the Air Force long, called Larry Warren. Very controversial figure because he's always been attacked. But interestingly, for the book, I finally managed to have this interview, and I did this advanced interview with him, and it worked. And he really relived the incident, and he said, without any persuasion or any, no influence, he said that an incident had taken place in a farmer's field where another craft, bigger, perhaps 30 feet across, had landed. Originally, there'd been a strange fog on the ground, like a circular patch of mist that was maybe 1 to 2 feet off the ground, but in a strange circular pattern, and it was glowing. Then all of a sudden, and it's surrounded by US Air Force security police officers. All right, so maybe 15 security police officers in a cordon around this patch of strange glowing mist. Then all of a sudden, somebody says, it's coming, and then a red light the size of a basketball, often described in UAP encounters and there are other basketball incidents in the book that basically comes from the direction of the North Sea, and it was only about 4 miles away, the sea, from this location, and then it stops over and hovers above the mist, and then all of a sudden there's an explosion of light. Everybody's dazzled, but when they readjust their eyes, there is a structured craft there, perhaps 30 feet across. And what comes from that is Adrian Bustinza says, I was part of that cordon. This original military whistleblower said it first, that there'd been this incident in the field. It's really contentious because until my book, it had never really been corroborated. But then Sergeant Adrian Bustinza comes in and says, I was beside Larry Warren in that cordon. And yes, this incident happened. And more importantly, he said it was being filmed on early video and cinefilm. All right. So it's almost as if people knew it was going to happen, which is an interesting question in its own. But suffice to say that then entities. Now, here's the difference in perceptions. Everybody's perceptions are different. Larry Warren, the original military whistleblower, said he saw 3 small figures that emerged from the craft in what was like a bubble. No doorways opened, but like a bubble slipped off the fabric of the craft. And then the bubble split into 3 parts. And within each of the 3 bubbles was the upper torso of what we can only describe as somebody we would now probably look at as a grey, that kind of figure, typical alien grey. Now, he will say that, whereas the difference between Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who corroborates it, he was very religious, and he found it very difficult to talk about what had happened. And for many, many years, other than making a few online comments, had never really spoken publicly in terms of media. He'd absolutely shied away from it. It really affected him. He'd had post-trauma. It caused him a lot of family problems. He suffered nightmares. He'd suffered some slight injuries, which we can talk about later on in the course, because some people were affected by being in close proximity.
Right. Is he the one that's giving testimony at the citizens' disclosure event?
I doubt it. I doubt it. As yet, despite my book being out now since February of 2023, nobody has approached him. Nobody's approached Airman Steve Longero regarding their new testimony in terms of the media, which is wrong.
We'll research that, because I don't know if you heard Stephen Bassett a few years ago made this citizen disclosure hearing.
I was there. In 2013.
There, right? Okay.
I was one of the witnesses.
There were some Rendlesham Forest witnesses who spoke about the medical effects, negative effects.
Yes. Well, that the
different story.
Hearing, pertain to injuries to, in particular, John Burroughs. Now, right. John Burroughs was the one who was caught up in this light. So he came into contact with something, and he began to have, I think, heart problems, and he was very ill at one point, and then he had to have a major operation. Fortunately, he's okay now, but he eventually was paid out by the Veterans VA. And that was supposedly because of injuries caused at Rendlesham Forest. It's still up for debate whether that was actually said. He said unequivocally it was, and I suspect it was, but the document was never supplied to the media that actually created that link.
Well, it's interesting. Having spent 8 weeks looking at Roswell with the students and Dawn, Roswell seems almost like a simplistic event, with compared to this feels more like a kind of multi-layered concert symphony type of thing.
I say in the book that for me personally, that the Rendlesham Forest case is the most complex UFO case there's ever been, because of the politics, both at government level, military level, on both sides in the UK and in the US. There are so many different layers, and I suspect if anybody who's read my book, it will highlight that there is evidence to say that there were agendas at play potentially between some of the witnesses who were involved. So it's a very, very complicated. The key thing to summarize is that we're not talking one or two incidents. My book reveals 17 different timed UFO UAP events over what we now, based on the New Testament, about a week-long period.
Wow.
Not just 2 or 3 days, as we thought for many, many years. We're probably looking at a week-long period.
And there were visitations before that.
Yeah, plus there were several. There's a very interesting case that's originally in my book. I put 18 incidents over that 7-day period. But after the publication of the book, one of the new witnesses I found, a guy called James Stewart, James Stewart, he revealed to me that he'd made an error. Not in the sense of what happened to him was not real, but he said that he left the base, I think, in February of 1980. So he left the base 10 months before the main December incidents took place. And he had an amazing Christmas experience, literally, I think, December the 27th, 1979. And up until this point, nobody had ever heard of that. So this is a major incident that is very interesting.
Would it be fair to say it's not really the Rendlesham Forest incident, but more like the Rendlesham Forest visitation, continued or extensive visitation?
Yeah, there were sightings reported after in early January, and I'm sure that there were others afterwards. The key thing is that in the lead up to those main events, there are now 4 really credible cases that happened in December of 1979, based on New Testament, happened in February of 1980, July 1980, and November 1980. And nobody talks about those. And the press do not link these together, but they're UFO related, and they happen on the bases, over the bases. So they have to be related. It's like it was building up to something in late December 1980. So suffice to say that the people who booked for this course are going to one, understand how a cold case works from a police perspective, how to treat witnesses, techniques that can be used, they're trying to be objective and removing bias from everybody. And basically, you're going to follow this reinvestigation. We'll talk about, in the first week, we're going to talk about the nature of evidence and objectivity. We're going to talk about a review of the early evidence that had been accumulated before it became well known in 1983. We're then going to look at what had been established prior to my reinvestigation, which began in 2017. So all of these are very interesting in setting the scene. And along the way, we'll talk about how you interview, tips on interviewing, tips on body language and how to interpret non-verbal communications, those kind of things that all come from my advanced interviewing background. Suffice to say that it will be a very deep dive over 4 successive Wednesdays into the case, and you'll be amazed at just how much material you did not know.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. There are so many questions in the chat, people asking about the hieroglyphs inside this triangular, rather small craft that was supposedly
3 meters by 3 meters.
Yeah. Has there been ever any kind of comparison of the memory of those hieroglyphs to the ones from Roswell or the ones that Danny Sheehan saw? It's difficult, right?
I wouldn't say that there are similarities, but you've got real questions, because the proof of the I-beam in Roswell is literally down to the memory of Jesse Marcel Jr. He was 12, I think, at the time. So how accurate his memory is when you recreate the symbols, I guess, is difficult to establish and corroborate, because there's nobody else to corroborate it. And whether he got them right or got them wrong, we'll never know. And sadly, he's passed away. With regards to the symbols that were allegedly on the 3 meter by 3 meter landed craft, as it were, on what was classed originally as the first night, then we only have the descriptions that turned up in Jim Peniston's, the witness's, pocketbook, his police notebook, where he drew them, allegedly drew them at the time. And so we only have those. But again, nobody else saw those symbols. So in a
Right.
sense, they're what's called standalone testimony. And there is no corroboration. No other person says, yeah, I saw those too. So again, when it's standalone information without corroboration, especially on major things, you have to take a pinch of salt and step back and say, well, there's no reason to call these people liars, but there's no corroboration. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
If two people see somebody stab a person to death, that's much better testimony because they both corroborate that there was a stabbing and someone died. If it's only one person saying, well, I stabbed him, but it was an accident, then it throws up lots of other things, because then you have to, was it self-defense, those kind of things. So you have to always look for corroboration where possible.
Right. Here's a question in the chat, and I've heard this rumor too, that somebody said or got the impression that these were humans from the future visiting us. I'm not quite sure where this comes from, but
this comes from Sergeant Jim Peniston, the guy who was closest to the craft, who touched it, photographed it. The photographs, he says, later came out fogged, perhaps through radiation or whatever. He never got them back, as it were. He took them to the photo lab afterwards, went back a few days later, and they said they were fogged. He said many years later, but this is contentious. And as a former police officer, I have real issues over the way this information came out. It came out 30 years after the event by the witness, Jim Peniston, and he basically said 30 years later to a UK audience when he was over here at a conference, that he basically said when he touched the craft, he then received like an electric shock, and a download of images went into his mind. Then he said the next day after the incident, he felt compelled to write down in his police notebook a series of zeros and ones, which turns out to be binary code, which he then revealed to the world in 2010, although there are question marks around that, but that's not for now. We'll stick with the original definition story. He basically revealed in 2010 that he'd received this download and he didn't know what they were. And eventually somebody says, what's those in your pocketbook? And he gets them examined, and they supposedly have coordinates all around the world, 7 coordinates, including the pyramids, a place, High Brazil, a little island that's sunken allegedly off the coast of Ireland, in the sea. All these, but in the end, there's no corroboration to this whatsoever. It's a standalone account, and he's saying that it was basically humans from the future coming back. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a possibility. It does crop up now. I think is it Professor McMasters. He's said recently that his take on it is that it might be humans coming back. I guess anything is possible.
yeah,
but you've got to examine the testimony, and the testimony I have issues with, because one, it's a standalone, and two, the way the information was revealed initially when it was released over the early few weeks. When he released that, he made some very contradictory statements on radio shows and things like that, which throws up red flags for me as a former detective. That aspect I have issues with. So some people will believe that there was it was humans coming back from the future. Personally, if you ask me, I don't think it is that. I still think it's probably a non-human, whether it be extraterrestrial, interdimensional,
right,
ultra-terrestrial, whatever. But that we can talk about on the course. But
yeah,
when I look at things, it has to be through the point of view of evidential. And so, for example, when I cast doubt about the veracity of these alleged binary codes, it's not because I offer ill will. It's not. It's a question of looking at early interviews that he did once he made that announcement, and then finding many inconsistencies in his story on different radio shows in the few weeks afterwards, which would show to me inconsistency about something so bizarre, kind of world-changing event that I think you'd remember. And he made it a very, one as an example. Initially, he said he released 6 pages for study of the binary code that was written in his pocketbook. Then he said that there were 8 pages. Then he said there were like 10 pages, 12 pages. It turns out there were 16 pages. Now, to keep saying different numbers is odd to me, because even if you were asked how many pages was it, which somebody would do as soon as you talked about it, somebody would say, well, how many pages of these codes was there? Then you'd think that he'd have gone, well, I'm not sure, I'll have a look.
Right. Yeah. It's
and he'll
curious.
go,
We can
6.
we'll look into it in the course. I was just thinking, there have been.
It's very, very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, if
this
you look at
is what you're now realizing is the course is evidential, but it's also very, very multi-layered. It is not a straightforward case. And if you think of Roswell, it's a seminal case in UFO history, but essentially it was an alleged craft of some kind that was initially admitted, and then within hours then became another story, and then there's been other stories. So basically it was an alleged crashed UFO that was initially admitted as a crashed UFO, and then basically the military backtracked, and then the cover-up begins. But that's it. Whereas this is multi-layered, and a lot of the best information I still think is out there. I think there are far more witnesses who have yet to come forward on this case.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Gary. There are lots of positive shout outs here in the chat. Kim says, thank you so much, Gary, for your dedication and putting your police experience to work here, for your high professionalism and so on and so forth. And yeah, well, Kim, we hope to see you in the course. I'm going to put the link to the course here one more time. We start next Wednesday at which is 8 p.m. European time, and at 7 p.m. British time, and it is 11 a.m. Pacific. And now we're gonna actually switch gears and continue in the after chat, where you can get to know the people that have been so actively commenting. And we'll be back tomorrow with Humanity Rising for a new episode. But thank you so much, Gary. I think you did a great job in kind of showing the complexity of this. I call it now the visitations, the Rendlesham Forest visitations. I'm going to change
my book actually captures it. It's non-human. That's the title, non-human. The Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, because it's many different timed events over a few days.
Awesome. All right. So thank you so much. And
I'm happy to stay in the chat afterwards if you wish.
Yeah, well, we're now going to switch to a different Zoom channel, and that's then the after chat.
Okay.
So we'll close down the session, and I'm going to send you a link for the other one, and then we'll be there.
Okay, see you soon.
See you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
See you tomorrow with Janice, who will be hosting a session on the, you could say, esoteric aspects of the layout of Washington, D.C.